This is the Convene podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Convene Talk, where we discuss interesting stories that appear in our popular newsletter, News Junkie. My name is Magdalena Tanasova, Digital Media Editor at Convene. Casey, start us off.
Hi, this is Casey Gale, Managing Editor of Convene. And this week I want to talk about some research recently published by University of Sydney's Sydney Environment Institute. They published findings from an international virtual academic conference called Material of Life Conference, which was a 2-day, 400 attendee experience in 2021 that was hosted completely online. The researchers shared a lot of interesting information here. They talked a bit about how virtual events can represent a significant reduction in financial burden for attendees, as well as lessening the carbon footprint it leaves. But something I really wanted to focus on was the fact that organizers of this conference pretty effectively helped attendees connect with one another socially. And I feel like that's really important because we know a common criticism of virtual events is that they don't foster connections the way face-to-face events do. Researchers found that many of the participants felt a shared experience with their fellow attendees because this virtual event featured avatars that were able to actually move about a virtual space that included settings like a cafe, a terrace, a garden, a game room. And you could sort of walk up to a group of people and hear their conversation as you got closer to them, and then join in and say hello if you wanted to. And then participants were also encouraged to meet for a virtual coffee session after every session they attended. The researchers found that it wasn't perfect. 71% of participants felt like they made fewer connections than at an in-person event. But the flip side of that is that 70% did report making some connections and that they felt a sense of community with the other attendees, which kind of pushes back on the notion that informal networking is impossible online.
I love that aspect of it. I'm Michelle Russell, Editor-in-Chief. I think what surprised me about the MeetingSpark survey was how many, like 42% of respondents said that they're back to fully in-person events and they're not doing any digital events, which to me is a lost opportunity. And it was reinforced by the podcast, Maggie, that you published on the whole kind of rinse and repeat approach to events, which is this worked in the past, let's bring it back and do exactly what we used to do. And in News Junkie, there are just so many times where we come across an article about how different groups don't want to attend an event in person because of the sustainability issue, particularly if they're scientists or having to do with nature and the environment. And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of planners have told us that it's too expensive to do a digital version. It's too time intensive. They don't have the staff to do it. And it seems like there are so many reasons to invest in that because of the way we're going, we're moving in the future, and that there are so many different technologies, I think, that can circumvent the whole issue of not being able to make connections or whatever the hurdles were during the pandemic. I also found that story really interesting.
Hi, I'm Barbara Palmer. I'm the deputy editor. One thing that I was thinking about when I read the story is that so much of the experience with online meetings that planners have were in that incredibly compressed get it on because of the pandemic. It was really like the most utilitarian, just how do we get what we've already created for an in-person meeting? How do we then just put that online? And I feel like what this study, particularly a study that really just looked into all the aspects of the environment they created, really showed how much potential there is. And I was struck by the fact that they had music, they had concerts, which is something we just wrote about, how music can connect people. The one thing I do think is a big unknown is what does actually happen when you're in person. And maybe that's not replicable. But that doesn't mean that you should shut off all the things that can happen online. Like, it's not, this big debate is not which is better. It's like, which is better for this use. I really encourage anyone to go back and read those studies because they were really rich.
And I think to your point, Barbara, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was such a rush to just get the content up there and get people the education they need. And the social aspect was not emphasized because there was not enough time. And in the beginning, it really didn't feel that important. But I think as we move forward, events like these really show that you can create those spontaneous moments as long as you put the extra time and maybe money into it, that people can, as we're now not so rushed. We don't have to have virtual events anymore, but have the benefit of some time to really thoughtfully design these events.
I'm Jen Dienst here, senior editor. So this made me think of a really good example of how this can happen in a virtual or digital space. A few months ago, I wrote a story about the World Economic Forum, which was one of the first major global events on that scale to be held in the metaverse. And I thought it was interesting when I interviewed one of the organizers of the event. She shared that they actually saw happenstance connection happen in real time in one of the spaces where two of the attendees virtually bumped into each other and they started negotiating. And this was, I believe she told me this was ahead of more formal negotiations that had been planned, but since they bumped into each other, she said that, it basically invited a larger conversation with other members in the group. And she says it was a really great, fruitful conversation that happened. Of course, it probably would have happened in real life too, but it shows that those types of instances can happen in the virtual space. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops and evolves as events kind of utilize those kinds of spaces more and more.
I was just going to piggyback on what Barbara said, is like what use or what goal you're trying to accomplish. It's also the audience, because I think we don't recognize how many people are unable to travel, whether it's disability or economics. And so you expand your audience, and maybe for those people, it's a great opportunity and it's good enough. They get what they need. And that's why it's really important to make sure that that is not just taken off the table when it comes to how you approach events.
In the excitement over face-to-face, which is of course warranted now that we're able to meet in person again, that aspect of it is lost, that there are a lot of barriers to entry for people, whether it's cost or disability or, as you said earlier, people who are very sustainability minded and really, really don't want to travel across the country to attend something, that there should be an option for all of those people. And that only benefits an organization because it expands their reach.
I also had a lot of thoughts reading this, and it comes from my background coming from a PCO, especially being in the PCO world while the pandemic happened and seeing how, event planners had to react on their feet in these moments. So I just want to bring up the fact that the event was held in 2021. That's 2 years ago. So we need to be mindful of the time gap and how many things evolved since 21 for hybrid and virtual. Of course, event planners want to go back to in-person now. It's their natural instinct. But also there is something else that I think the industry is not saying enough. We always exclude somebody. There is no case in any event around the world that is completely inclusive for absolutely everybody in the world. I don't think it's humanly possible to create such an event. I mean, if somebody creates that in the future, kudos, but I don't really see it happen because you need to have it held somehow, somewhere. People need to probably pay something to somebody. I mean, there's too many factors that would always exclude somebody.
This is Kurt Wagner, digital editor. What I didn't one of these studies talk about also sort of the trickle down, where if you have an in-person meeting, then you take some of the content from that meeting and you can do online meetings that are maybe smaller groups that are specific, like in an academic conference, maybe they would be a certain area, or a medical conference, maybe they would be a certain kind of doctor. I like sort of that mix of being able to focus in then with the online thing. I do think that everybody's sort of just gone back to in-person meetings just because that's what they know, and everybody feels that's the best way to have those personal connections and everything. And maybe in a larger meeting, that's the case. But I think if everybody could use their content throughout the year in better ways, whether it's bringing that speaker back for a session or something, and having people be able to do a Q&A with that speaker online, gives everyone in the organization a chance maybe to get involved. I think it's hard for people to do hybrid meeting because it's doing 2 meetings at once and nobody has the staff to do that, and nothing gets, something's going to sort of not get the full attention, I guess. Maybe that's the way to go, one or the other, or spread it all out.
But there's one other element that's really difficult to achieve online with a fully virtual event, and that's putting the groundwork before the meeting for people to engage and be open and kind of following the same ground rules. It's really, really hard, and people really have to be invested in the meeting. And I believe what the studies also showed was that people are multitasking during the event. It was not that they were fully focused on the virtual event. Very few of them were fully focused. I believe we all experienced that during the pandemic. We tried to attend virtual events and do emails on the side. Not that we're not doing that also in person. Let's face it, how many of us are taking business calls and doing emails and whatnot during an event? But with a fully virtual event, there's more pressure on the person to pay attention in multiple places, and really putting the work with the attendees and having them engage beforehand, and understanding that when you're in an online, Zoom room with people you don't know, how you have to behave. We've all seen incredible pictures on Zoom calls with people that were not really mindful of the fact that that was a business meeting, or were not really, they were just trying to take over the room and speak on top of everybody. And just cleaning those instances out, I think, takes a lot of work on behalf of the organizers and that of the attendees. And it's really, really hard to do.
When you were talking about how you have to exclude people, I think that's absolutely true that people are excluded. What I think, particularly in an academic setting, I think what this really underlines for me is how important it is to define what you're excluding, who you're excluding, and what the cost is. Because I feel like one thing that's so exciting about innovation just happens everywhere. Like at a scientific meeting, if it's only the big companies that send people, if it's only the established researchers, you multiply the opportunity to be in touch with ideas that are different if there are more people that are coming. So I think your point is so well taken, to know why you are excluding, who you're excluding, and what the cost is.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And I think that's a great wrap up of our conversation for this week's Convene Talk. And to our listeners, until next time.